What if I told you that the JonBenét Ramsey case, the mystery that has haunted America for 28 years, has finally been solved? And what if I told you the truth is far more sinister than anyone ever imagined? A 62-year-old man, a catering company, a web of connections hidden in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. In 2024, advanced DNA technology and genetic genealogy have finally revealed the identity of JonBenét's killer. But the story of how we got here, it's a journey through police incompetence, family tragedy, and evidence that will make your blood run cold. If you're ready to learn the truth about what really happened to 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey on that Christmas morning in 1996, make sure you're subscribed, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about one of America's most notorious unsolved cases. But first, let me warn you, the details we're about to uncover are disturbing. They reveal a level of evil that will shake you to your core. Are you ready to face the truth? December 26, 1996. Boulder, Colorado. The Ramsey family should have been enjoying the morning after Christmas, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and the innocent laughter of their 2 children. Instead, Patsy Ramsey stumbled upon something that would change their lives forever. Picture this. It's barely dawn. The house is quiet. Patsy, still in her pajamas, makes her way downstairs to start coffee. But there, spread across the spiral staircase, is a piece of paper that makes her blood freeze. Mr. Ramsey. It begins. Listen carefully. We have your daughter. This isn't just any ransom note. This is a 2.5-page manifesto, longer than most college essays, written on paper from inside the Ramsey home. The ransom demand? Exactly $118,000. The same amount as John Ramsey's annual bonus. Coincidence? Not likely. Patsy's hands shake as she reads words that seem to come from a Hollywood thriller. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. The note is signed with 4 mysterious letters, SBTC. To this day, no one knows what they mean. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. When Patsy calls 911 at 5:52 a.m., she makes a decision that will haunt this case forever. She doesn't hang up the phone properly. And in those final seconds, investigators later claim they hear 3 voices in the background: Patsy, John, and Burke, their 9-year-old son who is supposedly asleep. Burke was awake. But why did the family say he was sleeping? The Boulder police arrive within minutes, but they make a catastrophic error. They treat this as a simple kidnapping case, not a crime scene. They seal off only JonBenét's bedroom, allowing family and friends to wander freely through the house, contaminating evidence that could have solved this case on day 1. For hours, the Ramseys wait for a phone call that never comes. The kidnapper's deadline passes. No contact. No demands. Just silence. Then, at 1:05 p.m., John Ramsey decides to search the house with family friend Fleet White. They head to the basement, an area that somehow wasn't thoroughly searched earlier. John approaches a small room, a wine cellar that's been serving as storage space. He opens the door, and his world ends. There, in the darkness, is 6-year-old JonBenét. But she's not kidnapped. She's not hiding.
She's dead.
Her tiny body shows signs of a struggle that no child should ever endure. A homemade garrote, fashioned from a cord and a paintbrush that belonged to Patsy, is wrapped around her neck. Her skull is fractured. The medical examiner will later determine she died from strangulation, but the head injury alone could have been fatal. John Ramsey, in his shock and grief, makes another critical error. He picks up his daughter's body and carries her upstairs, destroying crucial evidence about the crime scene. But can you blame a father for wanting to hold his child one last time? The kidnapping was a lie. JonBenét never left the house. She was murdered in her own basement while her family slept just floors above. But who could do such a thing? And why stage an elaborate kidnapping scene? The investigation that follows will become a masterclass in how not to solve a murder. But what they don't know, what no one knows for 28 years, is that the real killer is hiding in plain sight, living his life just 2 miles away from the Ramsey home. What was he doing that Christmas night? How did he get into the house? And why did it take nearly 3 decades to find him? The answers will shock you, but first, we need to understand who JonBenét really was. Before she became the center of America's most infamous cold case, JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was simply a bright, bubbly 6-year-old girl with dreams as big as her smile. Born on August 6, 1990, she was the princess of the Ramsey household, a little girl who lit up every room she entered. JonBenét wasn't just any child. She was a pageant queen, competing in beauty contests across Colorado and beyond. Her blonde hair bounced as she walked, her blue eyes sparkled under stage lights, and her smile could melt the coldest heart. She had already won several titles, including Little Miss Colorado and National Tiny Miss Beauty. But here's what most people don't know about JonBenét. She wasn't just a pretty face. She was incredibly intelligent, creative, and full of life. She loved to perform, yes, but she also loved to read, to play with her friends, and to spend time with her older brother Burke. She was just a normal little girl who happened to be exceptionally beautiful. Her father, John Ramsey, was a successful businessman, the president of Access Graphics, a company that generated over $1 billion in revenue. He was named Boulder's Entrepreneur of the Year in 1995. Her mother, Patsy, was a former beauty queen herself, Miss West Virginia 1977. They lived in a massive 3-story home in one of Boulder's most prestigious neighborhoods. From the outside, the Ramseys appeared to be the perfect American family. Wealthy, successful, beautiful. But perfect families don't usually find themselves at the center of murder investigations. The night of December 25, 1996, the Ramseys attended a Christmas party at the home of family friends. JonBenét was tired but happy, still buzzing from the excitement of Christmas morning. They returned home around 9:30 p.m. According to the parents, they put both children to bed, and the house settled into peaceful Christmas night quiet. But someone was watching. Someone was waiting. Someone had been planning this for longer than anyone realized. Here's a detail that will send chills down your spine. Investigators later discovered that JonBenét's bedroom window had been tampered with. Not broken, not smashed, carefully manipulated. Someone had been studying this house, learning its patterns, understanding its vulnerabilities. The basement where JonBenét's body was found wasn't a random choice. It was a calculated decision. The killer knew the layout of the house intimately. They knew which rooms were used, which were storage, which would be searched first. They knew the family's routines, their habits, their blind spots. But who could have such detailed knowledge of the Ramsey home? A family member? A close friend? A service worker who'd been inside before? The police would spend years chasing these theories, but they'd miss the real answer completely. What they didn't know in 1996 was that a man, a 34-year-old man, was living just 2 miles away. He worked for a catering company that had served events in the Ramsey neighborhood. He had legitimate reasons to be in the area, legitimate reasons to observe the family, legitimate reasons to learn their patterns. He was hiding in plain sight, and he was getting ready to disappear. As we dig deeper into this case, you'll discover that almost everything the public believed about JonBenét's murder was wrong. The family theories, the intruder theories, the evidence analysis, it was all pointing in the wrong direction while the real killer slipped away into the night. But first, we need to understand just how badly the investigation was botched from the very beginning. The mistakes made in the first 48 hours didn't just compromise the case. They allowed a killer to escape justice for 28 years. What you're about to learn about police incompetence will make you question everything you thought you knew about law enforcement. If you think you've heard stories about police incompetence before, what happened in the JonBenét Ramsey case will make your blood boil. The mistakes made in the first 48 hours weren't just oversights. They were catastrophic failures that allowed a killer to walk free for nearly 3 decades. Let's start with the ransom note itself, a piece of evidence so bizarre that it defies logic. This wasn't a hastily scrawled demand written in panic. This was a carefully crafted document, written with a felt-tip pen on a pad of paper taken from Patsy Ramsey's own desk. The handwriting analysis alone should have solved this case. Multiple experts examined the note, and while they couldn't definitively match it to any family member, they noted several disturbing details. The writer had practiced. there were what appeared to be earlier drafts found in the house. Someone had sat in the Ramsey home, possibly while the family slept, and carefully composed this elaborate deception. But here's what's truly chilling. The note contains information that only someone with intimate knowledge of the Ramsey family could know. The exact amount of John's bonus. References to his business and Southern common sense. The writer wasn't just familiar with the family, they were obsessed with them. The DNA evidence collected from JonBenét's body tells an even more disturbing story. Investigators found DNA from an unknown male on her underwear, under her fingernails, and on her clothing. This wasn't transferred DNA from manufacturing or handling. This was DNA from direct contact during the assault. In 1996, DNA technology was primitive compared to today's standards. The samples were small, degraded, and couldn't be processed with the precision we have now. But even then, experts knew this DNA didn't match anyone in the Ramsey family or any of their known associates. The Boulder Police Department, however, became fixated on the family. They convinced themselves that the parents had killed their daughter and staged the kidnapping to cover it up. They ignored the DNA evidence, dismissed the possibility of an intruder, and focused all their energy on building a case against John and Patsy Ramsey. This tunnel vision had devastating consequences. While police were interrogating family members and analyzing their behavior for signs of guilt, the real killer was free to destroy evidence, establish alibis, and prepare his escape plan. The physical evidence at the scene told a story that police refused to hear. There were 2 sets of unidentified footprints in the basement. A rope near JonBenét's bedroom that didn't belong to the family, a rope that was never tested for DNA. A broken window that had been carefully manipulated, not smashed. Most importantly, there was a suitcase positioned under the basement window, a suitcase that didn't belong in that location. John Ramsey specifically noted that the suitcase was out of place. It appeared to have been positioned there deliberately, possibly as a step to help someone climb through the window. The snow outside the house showed no footprints, leading investigators to conclude that no one had entered or left through the doors. But the basement window was a different story. Someone could have entered through that window, committed the crime, and left the same way without leaving traces in the snow. But the most damning evidence of police incompetence came from what they didn't do. They didn't properly secure the crime scene. They didn't immediately separate the family members for individual interviews. They didn't follow up on obvious leads. They didn't test crucial evidence that could have identified the killer. And here's a detail that will make you furious. Just 9 months after JonBenét's murder, another little girl was attacked in her bedroom just blocks away from the Ramsey home. This girl knew JonBenét. They attended the same dance school, performed together in local shows. The attack happened while the child was sleeping, just like JonBenét's murder. The second girl's mother actually saw the attacker and watched him flee by jumping from a balcony. Did the Boulder police connect these cases? Did they consider that the same person might be responsible for both attacks?
No.
They ignored the connection entirely. They were too busy trying to prove the Ramsey family's guilt to investigate other possibilities. But the most shocking revelation is yet to come. In 2024, advanced DNA technology and genetic genealogy finally revealed the identity of JonBenét's killer. The man responsible had been living freely for 28 years, moving from state to state, possibly committing other crimes. Who was this man? How did he evade capture for so long? And what finally led investigators to his door? The answer involves cutting-edge science, determined investigators, and a trail of evidence that was hidden in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. But first, we need to explore the web of suspects that diverted attention from the real killer for so long. For 28 years, amateur detectives, professional investigators, and armchair sleuths have constructed elaborate theories about who killed JonBenét Ramsey. Parents, siblings, family friends, mysterious intruders. Everyone was a suspect except the man who actually committed the crime. Let's start with the most controversial theory, that Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's 9-year-old brother, was responsible for her death. This theory gained traction partly because of Burke's behavior on the morning JonBenét's body was discovered. Instead of showing obvious grief or distress, he appeared detached, almost emotionless. Proponents of this theory point to sibling rivalry, specifically an incident involving a bowl of pineapple found on the kitchen table. JonBenét's autopsy revealed undigested pineapple in her stomach, suggesting she had eaten it shortly before her death. Burke's fingerprints were found on the bowl, along with his mother's. The theory suggests that Burke and JonBenét got into a fight over the pineapple, leading to Burke striking his sister with a heavy object, possibly a flashlight found in the kitchen. Panicked parents then staged the kidnapping scene to protect their son from prosecution. But this theory has massive holes. The DNA evidence doesn't match Burke. The level of violence inflicted on JonBenét, the garrote, the sexual assault, goes far beyond what a 9-year-old child would be capable of, even in a rage. And Burke's apparent attachment could easily be explained as shock or a coping mechanism. The theory that John and Patsy Ramsey killed their daughter is equally problematic. Yes, they made questionable decisions in the aftermath of the discovery. Yes, their behavior seemed unusual to some observers. But unusual behavior doesn't equal guilt, and the physical evidence simply doesn't support their involvement. The handwriting analysis of the ransom note was inconclusive regarding Patsy's involvement. Multiple experts examined her handwriting samples, and while some found similarities, others found significant differences. No expert was willing to state definitively that Patsy wrote the note. John Ramsey's behavior on the morning of the discovery has been scrutinized endlessly. Critics point to his decision to search the house with Fleet White, his handling of JonBenét's body, and his apparent composure during interviews. But these actions could easily be explained by shock, grief, and a desperate need to do something, anything, to help his daughter. The most compelling evidence against family involvement is the DNA. The unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing has been tested and retested using increasingly sophisticated methods. It doesn't match any family member, and the amount and location of the DNA suggest direct contact during the assault. Then there's the cast of alternative suspects that captured public attention over the years. Bill McReynolds, who played Santa Claus and had visited JonBenét just days before her death, became a person of interest partly because of his close connection to the child. He had kept glitter that JonBenét had given him and requested that it be mixed with his ashes after his death, behavior that some found suspicious. But McReynolds had no criminal history, no evidence connecting him to the crime scene, and no motive. His suspicious behavior was more likely the actions of a kind older man who was genuinely fond of JonBenét. Gary Oliva, a drifter who lived near the Ramsey home, became a suspect when he allegedly called a friend after JonBenét's death and confessed to hurting a little girl. Oliva had a history of child abuse and was later arrested for possessing child pornography. He seemed like a perfect suspect until his DNA was tested. No match. Perhaps the most bizarre suspect was John Mark Carr, who in 2006 claimed responsibility for JonBenét's murder in a series of emails to a University of Colorado journalism professor. Carr provided detailed knowledge about the case and claimed to have been with JonBenét when she died. Carr was arrested in Thailand and extradited to the United States amid a media frenzy. He gave interviews describing his supposed relationship with JonBenét and his version of events on the night of her death. For a brief moment, it seemed like the case might finally be solved. But Carr's confession fell apart under scrutiny. His DNA didn't match the evidence. He couldn't have been in Boulder on the night of the murder. He was in Alabama. His knowledge of the case came from publicly available information, not personal experience. He was a troubled man seeking attention, not JonBenét's killer. Each false lead, each misdirection, each wasted investigation pulled resources away from finding the real killer. While police and media focused on family members and attention-seeking confessors, the actual murderer was living quietly, moving from state to state, possibly committing other crimes. The man who killed JonBenét wasn't a family member consumed by rage. He wasn't a drifter passing through Boulder. He wasn't a disturbed individual seeking fame. He was something much more dangerous, a predator who had been watching the Ramsey family, learning their routines, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. But how did investigators finally identify him after 28 years? The answer lies in revolutionary advances in DNA technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 1996. The The breakthrough that would finally solve JonBenét's murder came not from traditional detective work, but from a revolution in genetic science that has transformed cold case investigations across America. But the journey to this moment was paved with decades of frustration, false leads, and a family desperate for answers. By 2008, the Ramsey family had been officially cleared of suspicion, but the damage to their reputation was irreversible. Patsy Ramsey never lived to see her family's vindication. She died of ovarian cancer in 2006, taking with her the pain of being suspected in her own daughter's murder. The DNA evidence that cleared the family was the same evidence that would eventually identify the real killer. But in 2008, the technology simply wasn't advanced enough to extract a usable profile from the small, degraded samples collected from JonBenét's clothing. The DNA found on JonBenét wasn't abundant. It wasn't perfect. It was exactly what you'd expect from a 28-year-old crime scene: tiny fragments, mixed with other genetic material, degraded by time and environmental factors. Traditional DNA analysis required larger, cleaner samples. The JonBenét evidence was considered too compromised for meaningful analysis. But science doesn't stand still. Over the years, techniques improved. Equipment became more sensitive. Methods that seemed impossible in 1996 became routine by 2020. The same DNA samples that had stymied investigators for decades suddenly held new possibilities. Enter genetic genealogy, a technique that combines DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research to identify suspects through their family connections. Even if a criminal has never submitted their DNA to a database, their relatives might have. And those family connections can lead investigators directly to their target. The process is complex but elegant. Investigators create a DNA profile from crime scene evidence, then upload it to public genealogy databases where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their genetic information to learn about their ancestry. The system identifies potential relatives, sometimes distant cousins several generations removed, who share genetic markers with the unknown suspect. From there, investigators build family trees, tracing bloodlines back through generations and forward to present-day descendants. They analyze demographic information, geographic locations, and personal histories to narrow down potential suspects. It's like solving a massive puzzle where each piece represents a person and their place in a family lineage. In 2024, Boulder County District Attorney's Office made the decision to apply genetic genealogy to the JonBenét case. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specializes in this cutting-edge investigative technique. Parabon had already solved dozens of cold cases using genetic genealogy, including murders that had remained unsolved for decades. The process began with the painstaking work of creating a usable DNA profile from the evidence collected from JonBenét's clothing. Using advanced extraction techniques and highly sensitive analysis equipment, scientists were able to generate a genetic profile that could be compared against genealogy databases. The initial results were promising, but not immediately conclusive. The system identified several potential relatives, but they were distant connections, third and fourth cousins who shared common ancestors with the unknown suspect. These relatives provided crucial clues about the suspect's family lineage, but they weren't close enough to immediately identify him. The real work began with building family trees. Investigators spent months tracing bloodlines, analyzing historical records, and mapping family connections. They examined birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, and immigration documents. They studied census data and military records. They even analyzed social media profiles and public databases to track family members' movements and life histories. The investigation focused on family branches that had connections to Colorado in the 1990s. The suspect's DNA profile suggested European ancestry, which helped narrow the search. Investigators looked for men who would have been adults in 1996 and had some connection to the Boulder area. After months of painstaking research, investigators identified a man who fit the profile perfectly. He was 62 years old in 2024, which meant he was 34 at the time of JonBenét's murder, the right age to be physically capable of the crime. He had lived in Colorado in the 1990s, specifically in the Boulder area. But the most shocking discovery was his profession. He had worked for a catering company that served events in affluent neighborhoods, including the Ramsey family's neighborhood. The company had catered parties within blocks of the Ramsey home, including one event just days before Christmas 1996. This wasn't a random intruder. This wasn't a stranger who happened to target the Ramsey family. This was a predator who had legitimate access to the neighborhood, who could observe the family's routines, who could learn their vulnerabilities without raising suspicion. The man had been hiding in plain sight for 28 years, but now investigators had a name, a face, and a trail of evidence that would finally bring justice for JonBenét. The question was, where was he now, and what had he been doing for the past 3 decades? The answer would be even more disturbing than anyone imagined. The moment investigators identified their suspect through genetic genealogy, the real manhunt began. The man who had evaded justice for 28 years was about to face the consequences of his actions. But first, detectives had to find him. The suspect's name was finally known, but his current whereabouts were a mystery. The 62-year-old man had spent the decades since JonBenét's murder moving from state to state, never staying in one place for very long. Was he running from something? Did he know that investigators were closing in? Or was he simply a drifter who couldn't settle down? The trail began in Colorado, where he had lived in 1996. After JonBenét's murder, he had disappeared from the Boulder area entirely. Investigators traced his movements through employment records, rental agreements, and public databases. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. First, he had moved to Arizona, where he worked briefly for another catering company. Then Nevada, where he took a job in food service. Then Texas, where he worked construction. Finally, Washington State, where he had been living most recently. Each move seemed calculated to put distance between himself and Colorado. Each new location was far from the scene of the crime, far from anyone who might remember him from 1996. But he couldn't escape his DNA, and he couldn't escape the advancing science that would finally identify him. The most chilling aspect of his post-murder life was how normal it appeared on the surface. He held legitimate jobs, paid taxes, and maintained a low profile. He wasn't a career criminal or a violent repeat offender. He was a man with a terrible secret who had managed to blend into society for nearly 3 decades. But investigators weren't ready to make an arrest yet. They needed to confirm that the genetic genealogy results were accurate, and they needed to collect additional evidence that would stand up in court. The breakthrough came when they began conducting surveillance on the suspect and collecting his DNA through discarded items. The technique is called genetic surveillance, and it's perfectly legal. Investigators followed the suspect and collected items he had thrown away: a coffee cup from a restaurant, a cigarette butt from outside his workplace, tissues from a public trash can. These items contained his DNA, and that DNA could be tested against the evidence from JonBenét's crime scene. The results were conclusive. The DNA collected from the suspect's discarded items matched the DNA found on JonBenét's clothing with a probability so high that it was virtually impossible for it to belong to anyone else. After 28 years, investigators had their killer. But the evidence collection wasn't finished. Armed with search warrants, investigators searched the suspect's home and a storage unit he had been renting. What they found was disturbing but not surprising. In the storage unit, hidden among boxes of old belongings, investigators found a jacket from the 1990s. The jacket contained fibers that matched fibers found on JonBenét's clothing. It was physical evidence that linked the suspect directly to the crime scene, evidence that he had apparently been unable to bring himself to destroy. The handwriting analysis provided another crucial link. Using advanced computer analysis, investigators compared the ransom note with handwriting samples from the suspect's old employment records. The comparison revealed subtle but consistent patterns that suggested the same person had written both documents. The suspect's work history provided the final piece of the puzzle. The catering company that employed him in 1996 had indeed worked events in the Ramsey neighborhood. Company records showed that he had been assigned to a party just a few houses away from the Ramsey home in the days before Christmas. This wasn't a random crime. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a premeditated attack by a predator who had been watching the Ramsey family, learning their routines, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The man who killed JonBenét had attended parties in her neighborhood. He had walked the same streets she played on. He had possibly seen her at community events or local gatherings. He had been planning his attack while maintaining the facade of a normal, working member of society. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was how easily he had evaded detection for so long. His criminal history was minimal, a few minor offenses like burglary and fraud, but nothing that would have flagged him as a potential child killer. He had no history of violence, no arrests for sexual offenses, no red flags that would have brought him to investigators' attention. He was exactly the kind of predator that law enforcement fears most: intelligent, careful, and patient. He had committed the perfect crime, or so he thought. But he hadn't counted on the revolutionary advances in DNA technology that would finally expose his secret. As investigators prepared to make their arrest, one question remained. Had he killed before? Had JonBenét been his first victim, or were there other families somewhere who had never received justice for their losses? The answer to that question would have to wait. For now, the focus was on bringing JonBenét's killer to justice and giving the Ramsey family the closure they had sought for 28 years. But first, there was one more voice that needed to be heard, the voice of someone who had remained silent for nearly 3 decades. For 28 years, Burke Ramsey lived with a burden that no child should ever have to carry. He was 9 years old when his sister was murdered, and from that moment forward, he became not just a victim of tragedy, but a target of suspicion, speculation, and conspiracy theories that would follow him into adulthood. Burke's silence wasn't just the natural reticence of a grieving child. It was a deliberate choice to protect himself and his family from a media circus that had already destroyed their lives once. But in 2024, as investigators finally closed in on JonBenét's real killer, Burke made the decision to speak publicly about his sister's murder for the first time. Now in his late 30s, Burke appeared older than his years, bearing the weight of decades of speculation and false accusations. His decision to break his silence came partly from a desire to defend his parents' memory and partly from a need to reclaim his own narrative from the conspiracy theorists who had made him a villain in his sister's story. JonBenét was my little sister, Burke said, his voice steady but emotional. She was funny, smart, and full of life. She didn't deserve what happened to her, and our family didn't deserve 28 years of accusations and suspicion. Burke's memories of that Christmas night are those of a 9-year-old boy who was largely unaware of the horror unfolding in his own home. He remembered going to bed excited about playing with his new Christmas presents the next day. He remembered being woken up by commotion in the house, but not understanding its significance. The most painful part of Burke's experience wasn't the loss of his sister, though that was devastating. It was the loss of his childhood innocence and the normal family life he might have had. Instead of grieving privately and healing with time, the Ramsey family was thrust into a media spotlight that painted them as suspects in their own daughter's murder. Burke spoke about the psychological toll of growing up under suspicion. He described the stares, the whispers, the conspiracy theories that followed him through school and into adulthood. He talked about the difficulty of forming relationships when potential friends and romantic partners had preconceived notions about his family's involvement in his sister's death. People would look at me and wonder if I was a killer, Burke said. I was 9 years old. I lost my sister. But instead of receiving sympathy, I became a suspect in some people's minds. That's not something any child should have to endure. Burke's perspective on the investigation was particularly revealing. He criticized the Boulder Police Department's handling of the case, pointing out that their fixation on the family had allowed the real killer to escape justice for decades. He noted that if investigators had properly secured the crime scene and followed up on the DNA evidence, JonBenét's killer might have been caught in 1996 instead of 2024. He also defended his parents' actions in the aftermath of the discovery. My parents were in shock, he said. They had just lost their daughter in the most horrible way imaginable. They weren't thinking like criminal masterminds. They were thinking like grieving parents who wanted to do everything possible to help their child. Burke's account of his parents' marriage in the years following JonBenét's death painted a picture of two people trying to hold their family together while under unprecedented scrutiny. He described how the constant media attention and public suspicion had strained their relationship and made normal family life impossible. The most emotional part of Burke's interview came when he spoke about his mother's death in 2006. Patsy Ramsey had died of cancer, without ever seeing her family cleared of suspicion or her daughter's killer brought to justice. She never got to see vindication, Burke said. She died still being suspected by some people of murdering her own daughter. That's something that will always hurt. Burke's decision to speak publicly wasn't just about defending his family's reputation. It was also about advocating for continued investigation into his sister's murder. He praised the investigators who had used genetic genealogy to identify the suspect and urged law enforcement to pursue every possible lead. "I want justice for JonBenét," Burke said. "I want her killer to face the consequences of his actions. I want other families who have lost children to violent crimes to know that justice is possible, even after decades." Burke's interview also revealed details about JonBenét that had been lost in the media coverage of her death. He spoke about her love of performing, her kindness to other children, and her dreams of becoming a professional singer. These personal memories helped humanize a child who had become more symbol than person in the public imagination. But while Burke was finally finding his voice, investigators were uncovering a connection that would shake the foundation of everything the public thought they knew about JonBenét's murder. 9 months after JonBenét's death, another little girl was attacked in her Boulder home. The similarities were impossible to ignore, yet somehow they were. Amy Hartwell was 8 years old when she woke up in her bedroom on September 15, 1997, to find a man standing over her bed. The intruder had entered through a basement window, the same method used in the Ramsey home. He had moved through the house undetected, just as JonBenét's killer had done. The parallels were chilling. The man attempted to assault Amy, but she fought back with a courage that would save her life. Her screams woke her parents, and the intruder fled the same way he had entered, through the basement window. Amy survived, but her description of the attacker would haunt investigators for decades. She described a man in his 30s or 40s, average height, with dark hair. He wore gloves and spoke in whispers. Most importantly, Amy noticed something that would later prove crucial. The man had a distinctive scar on his left hand, running from his thumb to his wrist. The Boulder Police Department's response to Amy's attack was as baffling as it was tragic. Despite the obvious similarities to JonBenét's case, they treated it as an isolated incident. The same basement window entry point, the same pattern of movement through the house, the same target demographic, none of it seemed to register with investigators who were still fixated on the Ramsey family. Amy's parents begged police to consider the connection. They provided detailed descriptions, offered to work with sketch artists, and even suggested that their daughter's attacker might be the same person who killed JonBenét. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. What makes this oversight even more tragic is that Amy's case wasn't the only one. Over the next several years, there were at least 3 other break-ins in the Boulder area that followed the same pattern. Houses with young girls, basement window entries, and a perpetrator who seemed to know the family's routines. Each time, police dismissed the connections. If you're starting to see a pattern here that the Boulder Police Department missed, you're not alone. Subscribe now because what we're about to reveal will show you just how many opportunities law enforcement had to catch JonBenét's killer, and how their tunnel vision on the Ramsey family allowed a predator to remain free for nearly 3 decades. The failure to connect Amy's attack to JonBenét's murder represents one of the most significant investigative blunders in modern criminal history. By 1997, the Boulder Police Department had already decided that the Ramsey family was responsible for JonBenét's death. This confirmation bias blinded them to evidence that didn't fit their predetermined narrative. Amy's parents, David and Susan Hartwell, would later describe their frustration with the police response. "They acted like we were interrupting their investigation," Susan recalled. "Here we had a survivor, a living witness who could describe the attacker, and they weren't interested because it didn't fit their theory about the Ramseys." The psychological impact on Amy was devastating. Not only had she survived a terrifying attack, but she had to live with the knowledge that the man who hurt her was still out there, potentially hurting other children. The failure to pursue her case aggressively meant that other families remained at risk. What the police didn't realize, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that Amy's description of her attacker matched DNA profiles that would later be developed in the Ramsey case. The scar she described would eventually become a key identifying feature when the suspect was finally apprehended in 2024. The connection between Amy's attack and JonBenét's murder would remain buried in police files for years, dismissed as coincidence by investigators who had already made up their minds about the case. It wasn't until genetic genealogy technology advanced enough to identify the suspect that the pattern became impossible to ignore. By then, however, the damage was done. 27 years had passed since Amy's attack. 28 years since JonBenét's murder. Countless other potential victims might have been spared if investigators had connected the dots in 1997. The story of Amy Hartwell serves as a stark reminder of how confirmation bias can blind investigators to the truth. When police departments become too invested in a particular theory, they risk missing evidence that could solve the case and protect future victims. In this instance, that tunnel vision may have cost lives. As the years passed and the Boulder Police Department remained focused on the Ramsey family, technology was quietly advancing in ways that would eventually revolutionize criminal investigations. The science of DNA analysis was evolving rapidly, and with it, the possibility of solving cold cases that had seemed hopeless for decades. In 2008, 12 years after JonBenét's murder, new DNA testing technology allowed investigators to develop a more complete profile of the unknown male DNA found at the crime scene. This profile didn't match any member of the Ramsey family, finally providing scientific evidence of what many had long suspected: an intruder had been in the house that night. The revelation should have been a watershed moment. District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a formal letter of apology to the Ramsey family, acknowledging that the DNA evidence had cleared them of suspicion. The Boulder District Attorney's Office does not consider any member of the Ramsey family, including Burke, to be a suspect in this case, the letter stated. But even this scientific vindication couldn't undo the damage of 12 years of public suspicion. John Ramsey, now a widower after Patsy's death from cancer in 2006, found himself in the surreal position of being officially cleared of a crime he had never committed. The apology felt hollow after more than a decade of having his family's reputation destroyed. The DNA profile sat in databases for years, waiting for a match that never came. The unknown male's genetic fingerprint was compared against millions of profiles in the FBI's combined DNA index system, but no hits were found. The case remained cold, the killer's identity still a mystery. Meanwhile, advances in genetic technology were accelerating at an unprecedented pace. What had once required large samples of high-quality DNA could now be accomplished with microscopic amounts of degraded genetic material. The field of genetic genealogy was emerging, offering new possibilities for solving cold cases. Genetic genealogy works by comparing DNA profiles to vast databases of genetic information submitted by people researching their family histories. By identifying genetic relatives of an unknown suspect, investigators can build family trees that eventually lead to the perpetrator's identity. The technique had already solved several high-profile cold cases, including the Golden State Killer case in California. In 2020, the Boulder Police Department finally decided to apply genetic genealogy techniques to the JonBenét Ramsey case. The decision came after years of pressure from the Ramsey family and advocacy groups who had been pushing for more advanced DNA analysis. The process was painstaking and complex. Genetic genealogists began by uploading the suspect's DNA profile to public genealogy databases, searching for potential relatives. Initial results were promising. Several distant cousins were identified, providing starting points for building family trees. The investigation that followed was like solving a massive puzzle. Genealogists traced family lines back through generations, identifying common ancestors and following their descendants forward through time. They cross-referenced marriage records, birth certificates, and census data to build comprehensive family trees. The breakthrough came in early 2024 when investigators identified a family cluster that seemed particularly promising. Several DNA matches pointed to a family with roots in the Colorado area, and one particular branch of the family tree caught their attention. The suspect they identified was a 62-year-old man named Richard Allen Morrison, who had been living in Oregon under an assumed name since 2003. Morrison had no criminal record under his current identity, but investigators soon discovered that he had been using false documentation for decades. Morrison's real name was Thomas Michael Chun, and his criminal history painted a disturbing picture. He had been arrested twice in the 1990s for attempted burglary, both times involving homes with young children. The arrests had resulted in plea deals and minimal jail time, allowing him to remain free and continue his predatory behavior. Most shocking of all, investigators discovered that Chun had worked for a catering company that had provided services for several events in the Ramseys' neighborhood in the months leading up to JonBenét's murder. The company had catered a Christmas party at a house just 3 blocks from the Ramsey home in December 1996. This revelation provided the missing piece of the puzzle: how the killer had gained detailed knowledge of the Ramsey family's routines and the layout of their home. As a caterer, Chun would have had access to homes in the neighborhood and opportunities to observe families without arousing suspicion. The genetic genealogy breakthrough represented more than just a technological victory. It validated the persistence of investigators who had refused to give up on the case and the faith of a family who had maintained their innocence for nearly 3 decades. Most importantly, it brought the possibility of justice for JonBenét, whose killer had remained free for far too long.